It's episode 178 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com, and I really appreciate it if you'd go over and click on the subscribe button over in the right-hand sidebar. It helps other people find the show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week. ThirdScribe.com is there to connect you, writers and readers, together. If you are a writer, you know that you need an author platform. You need a place where people can find you, read your books, buy your books, connect with you, and the same thing with readers. You can connect with some of your favorite authors at ThirdScribe.com. Please tell them that Hank sent you. Also, the new book by Aaron Saylor, Sewerville, a Southern gangster novel. It's like The Sopranos in Appalachia. Rises at times to lyrical beauty, says author Mark Rubenstein. A small-time hood tries to escape the family business in this powerful story of crime and drug abuse in rural America. Sewerville is violent and profane, but in the end, it's also deeply moving. Considered an essential tale of modern crime in the American South. Pick it up on Amazon.com. There's a link in the show notes. I'd also like to thank Daniel Arthur Smith and the great folks at Tales from the Canyons of the Dam. There's a brand new episode out. Go pick it up today. Go back and listen to last Friday's episode with Ed Gosney, and go click on the link to Ed Gosney's blog over in the right-hand sidebar, Cool Comics in My Collection, and go check out what Ed is doing. He's doing some fantastic work over there, and let him know that you heard about him on Author Stories. Also, if you're an author, there has been a lot of talk lately about changes to Amazon's algorithms and the way that they handle certain things. Now might be a good time for you to consider taking your book wide to as many retailers as possible. Draft to Digital can help you do that. Go to drafttodigital.com/author stories and see how they can help you take your book to as many people as possible. Next Thursday, I'm going to do a special live YouTube hangout with Kevin Tumlinson from Draft to Digital, and we're going to talk about taking your book wide and answering your questions and all sorts of fun stuff there. There's going to be a link to that live event down in the show notes. Go ahead and set your calendar for it. Don't forget to stay tuned after the episode for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' Jason Crane series. Now on to our show. Six String, the new book by Stefan Boltz. Jennifer Dalton dreamed of being a singer for as long as she could remember. The dream has kept her alive throughout a childhood mired in poverty in a broken and abusive home. When her younger brother dies and her mother takes refuge in alcohol, the emotional toll becomes unbearable. One morning she runs away, taking with her the one thing she owns, her beloved six-string guitar. This is the story of a girl finding herself alone in the good and the bad, the friends she makes, and a choice that could rob her of everything she's won. Six String by Stefan Boltz, now available on Amazon.com.
Please welcome to the stage, Jennifer Dalton!
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Greg Keyes on the show. Greg and I share a hometown, which was kind of crazy when you start doing a show like this and you make connections all over the world, and then you make a connection that you find out you have a deeper connection. So anyway, welcome to the show, Greg.
Oh, thanks. It's nice to be here.
Yeah. So I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
I think my first, it's hard to pinpoint a specific one, but, well, you're there in Meridian, so when I was a kid, we spent a lot of time at the Meridian Public Library.
Yeah.
And, I mean, way before I could read, my mom was reading to me, and I was ready to read pretty much before I got to first grade. I think I realized that as soon as I realized there was somebody being paid to write those books that I was learning to read, I think at that point I wanted to be a writer. And I started, pretty young, like a lot of kids do, making those, little storybooks that are held together by yarn and, illustrated in crayon, and pretty much only your mother reads them. But
right.
I did a lot of that pretty early on.
I think a lot of people have a similar experience to that, as, having that, when you're young and you discover stories and then you discover that, hey, I could do that. But rarely do we reach adulthood and immediately pursue that path. There's been a few on the show, but very rarely. What did you want to do, career wise when you got out of high school and that sort of thing?
Well, I always had the idea still that I wanted to be a writer, but what I wasn't willing to do was to bet everything on that.
Right. So
I continued to write. I read all through high school. I won a couple of little awards and got a couple of minor things published in a couple in the Meridian Community College literary magazine. And actually, there's a pretty good story about that we might be able to get to later. But so I was always encouraged to write. I had a certain amount of encouragement, a little bit of success, just a little, as a high school student. But what I majored in was anthropology. I always sort of knew I wanted to go in some sort of science. But coming out of high school, I was not particularly good at math, and so I aimed myself at the social sciences, and I pursued archaeology as an undergraduate, and then cultural anthropology as a graduate student. But the entire time I was doing that, I was also continuing to write, and it was, in some ways, actually, it was my coming to terms with how to write clear, concise, academic papers that helped me, I think, learn to write fiction better.
As someone that writes a lot of fantasy, like you do, and science fiction too, but I would think that anthropology and archaeology would be really great fields of study for someone who's kind of mining that territory.
That's true. I mean, it gave me a lot of some interesting perspectives. As a young kid, we didn't live in Meridian the whole time. We lived for a couple of years on the Navajo Indian Reservation out west. My father was the business manager of MJC, and then he became the business manager of this Navajo community college. And then we moved back to Meridian. I think I was in third or fourth grade. But yeah, I mean, it gave me a lot of material to draw on. It kind of amplified some things that I got from my childhood. And, the people I was working with as an anthropologist were mostly the Choctaw there in Mississippi. Right. And as an archaeologist, I was mostly working with, the remains of their ancestors, which kind of led me into some fairly specific paths when it came to the fiction I ended up writing, and I'm still writing, actually.
Now, as a youngster, and you're absolutely right, we do live very close to a pretty big Choctaw Indian reservation where we are. And I know you were young, but when you went to the Navajo Nation, what did that do for your perspective, or did you did you pick up anything from that experience?
Well, kids, often, if they're allowed to anyway, live in this world of imagination anyway.
Right.
And so I already had that going, and then I was also in a place where almost everybody I knew was Navajo. There were only a very few, as they called them, Anglo kids at the school, who believed in a landscape that was very much, full of spirits and stories and gods, for lack of a better word. And so I absorbed some of that. I learned a bit of Navajo just because I was in school all day. But mostly I just kind of this sort of animate living universe in which everything sort of has its own voice, I guess, I think had a long-standing effect on me. It certainly influenced the first novel I wrote, The Waterborne, which is very much about that. I mean, in fact, the two groups of people in that book are speaking languages that are related to Navajo. And it was just something that inspired both my fiction and my academic interests really up until the present time.
I want to get into that book, The Waterborne, in just a minute, but tell me the story that you alluded to a minute ago about the community college literary magazine.
Well, it was well after I had sold several novels, and I was on a signing tour. And had been a pretty big sort of national tour, but they sent me on sort of a southern leg, more or less at my own insistence. And so I believe I started in Athens, Georgia, where I was living at the time, and then I went to Birmingham. And in Birmingham, I was signing a book, and a good friend of mine, Mary Kay Culpepper, was at the time in Birmingham, and I believe she was the editor of Cooking Light, or one of the Southern Living imprints. But she came to my signing, and we were just chatting, and Mary Kay and I met, not because we went to school together, she is from Meridian, but because we were on a trip to Europe together that was sponsored by MJC, as it was called at the time, MCC now. And we also had a common friend in Ricardo Calderon, who was had been our French teachers. But she was a couple of years older than I was. But anyway, so we're sitting there in Birmingham, and I'm signing books, and this woman comes up, and she's carrying this old kind of yellowed thing, which turns out to be the Meridian Community College literary magazine from, I think, 1977 maybe. And she said, I just wanted to know if this was you. And it was this poem that I had written, when I was 15 and had gotten published in that. And that was interesting enough. And then Mary Kay said, well, let me look at that. And she took it, and she's like, I'm the editor on this.
Oh, wow.
So it was this weird little confluence of the local and the more grand.
Right.
But in some ways, it's just another illustration of how small the world actually is.
That's so cool. So you were writing all through your teen years, and you had serious aspirations of this, obviously, because this was you were steady putting out work. What about your family? Did they kind of recognize this in you, and were they motivating to you and encouraging?
Yeah, absolutely. My mother's family is originally from a little community called Beth Sadie, which is between where you are and Philadelphia, and and my mother, I think when she was born, they were still living in either a dirt floor shack or one that had, it was certainly one they built themselves. So I think a lot of people would think that a family like that from a very rural part of Mississippi wouldn't have that much interest in reading and writing, but they really valued it deeply. And, I remember my grandmother talking about having had read Herodotus by the time she was 15. And so they were extremely supportive of, any attempts by me to write. Even if they didn't necessarily understand what I was writing about. And my father and his family, the Keyes, were equally supportive. So that was never a problem I had. I never had anybody saying, maybe you ought not to do this, maybe you ought to do something else. That was something I kind of came to myself. I just kind of figured, well, I can write, and if I'm ever lucky enough to publish, then maybe I can make a living at it, but I need to do something else I enjoy on the way.
That's a great, some great points that you bring up there. I think a lot of people, we know a lot of people have some very misunderstood conceptions about the South and Mississippi in particular. That a lot of people can't even imagine the kind of poverty that you're talking about. And yet, in the midst of that poverty and that kind of desolation, we really do have a very proud literary tradition, and a lot of great literary minds have come from Mississippi. And there's this great juxtaposition of great story and the aspirations of being and doing better while in the midst of despair. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I don't think that my grandmother actually just passed away about this time last year, and my grandfather has been gone for a couple of years, and my mother is still alive. And I don't think any of them would have said that they felt they had grown up in poverty. And in fact, I know that specifically. I mean, they were right by the standards that you're talking about, but I think that they felt that they might not have had much money, but they lived pretty rich lives. Yeah. And so it's just some point I want to make. I mean, especially during the the 20s and 30s, that there's a lot of talk about where they got their food from, and so I don't. There wasn't a lot. I guess the long and short of that is there wasn't a lot of despair in my family. There was some aspiration, and the older generation in particular really wanted us to make something of ourselves,
right?
To do better than they had, and so college was something that was fairly stressed, to all of us growing up. And I went to college. My wife is also from Meridian, is a professor at the Savannah College of Art and Design here now in Savannah, and my brother's a chemical engineer for BP, and we all came out of Lauderdale County, and out of families who wanted us to do better, who encouraged us.
Right. Where did your love of science fiction and fantasy come from?
Science fiction was some of this. It was mostly science fiction at first that I read, and I really started reading that stuff in about first and second grade when I lived on the Navajo reservation. There wasn't a lot to do there. We were hundreds of miles from a grocery store.
Wow.
At one point, we had to drive about 20 miles to get drinking water. It was, the community was very small. We didn't have television. What we did have was a bookmobile that came by,
cool.
And just a small van that changed out the books it had every couple of months. And I was reading. Initially, I was reading things like Danny Dunn series, which was about a kind of a boy inventor. Tom Swift, more iconic boy inventor. But then also Lester Del Rey wrote a lot of, or had written for him, a lot of juvenile novels, and Isaac Asimov. And so by second or third grade, I was reading a lot of really kind of young adult science fiction. And I just kind of kept following that vein until sometime around fifth or sixth grade, I picked up a copy of The Return of the King, by Tolkien. And because of the cover on it, it had this weird cover with a bunch of like lizards and things. It's got this kind of 60s psychedelic cover. I thought it was science fiction. And by the time I realized it wasn't, I was already hooked. And bear in mind, that's the third book in that series. So I didn't even know really exactly what was going on.
Yeah, you're missing a little bit of story at that point.
Yeah, a little bit. But I went back and caught up. And then I kind of moved on to Ursula Le Guin and a lot of just kind of moved on, and I started reading a lot of fantasy as well as science fiction. But in terms of stuff I read, science fiction is still a lot of my favorite. Like Larry Niven was one of my favorite authors.
Sure.
Back in the day. But I find I'm better suited to writing to fantasy, and I have written some science fiction. The only one that I've got published that is unique to me and not part of a franchise would be Footsteps in the Sky, which is kind of a fusion of science fiction and Native American ideas. But yeah, that's pretty much what I always read.
You're talking about,
and whenever I had to do a book report at school, I would somehow bend the assignment or get the teacher to bend it to include. I can remember, in fact, in I think 7th or 8th grade, I asked if we were given a list of books we could do a book report on, and I asked if I could do The Lord of the Rings. And my teacher said, "Is that like Lord of the Flies?" And I said, "Yes."
It's just like it. As a matter of fact. Yeah,
just like it.
Right. You talk about picking up The Return of the King, and it had a science fiction-ish cover. There was that great time where science fiction was very fantastical, and the boundaries between those two were really blurred in a lot of ways, and I still really appreciate that science fiction can take us to the place where we can imagine the unimaginable. I would love to see some of those boundaries become more fluid again.
Well, I think there have always been some people doing that. I think about Roger Zelazny, for instance. He wrote a lot of stuff that kind of moved in and out of that. I wrote a sort of an alternate history fantasy series called The Age of Unreason, which was inspired by, for instance, Michael Moorcock and some other writers who always kind of felt free to move in and out of the ideas of fantasy and science fiction kind of fluidly, like you're describing. And I guess I like things at the extreme now and then as well. I like some of the really hard science fiction. But I just find I'm not suited to write that. I don't have the kind of engineering and science background that would make me good at that.
Yeah, I don't even try either. That's I I'm way too intimidated to write hard science fiction. So tell me about the first book that you sold.
Well, the first book I sold was probably about the fourth book I wrote. I had written I had set myself a goal, and this was when I was in my middle to late 20s. I was married. My wife was extremely indulgent of this habit I had. I had a night job. I worked during the day as well. So I took my then typewriter to work with me at night. I was a security guard at a retirement condominium. And I did what I could. And the first couple of things I wrote were fantasies with basically all Native American casts, set in the 1350s with no wandering Welshmen or Norsemen or anything like that. And I wrote them on spec. I generally wrote them kind of quickly. I only had about 3 months in the summer when I could really sit down and write hard. And I didn't sell any of those, but I did get them in front of an editor at Avon who really liked them. And this was when that was just still barely possible to get something in front of a major publishing house editor without an agent. I managed through that process, and this is the early 90s, to get an agent, a very good agent, who was an agent of a good friend of mine. And he began to shop my books, but he didn't sell them. But, the advice they give you is, once you've gotten something written and you've got it out there, somebody's trying to sell it, just try to forget about it and write something else. So that's pretty much what I did. I wrote a book a year for several years, and then I finally wrote The Waterborne, and The Waterborne sold pretty quickly, I would say in a month. And up until that time, I didn't have even a message machine at home. I had no way to get messages. If you tried to call me, I pretty much had to be there to pick up the phone. And my agent actually reached me after 2 days of struggle in my department at the University of Georgia, where I was a grad student. And so I got the news there, and was pretty happy about it, because they wanted that novel, The Waterborne, and they also wanted an unwritten sequel, which I knew that was needed, but I wasn't willing to write it until I'd had somebody shown some interest in the first one. But it was a book in which I sort of took a lot of the earlier books, the Native American books, essentially had gotten to the point where marketing was looking at them, and marketing said, we really just can't sell these books. There's no market for this. This is before Dances with Wolves and this sort of whole renaissance of interest in Native American things. And I thought, well, okay, if that's true, then what if I took some of these same ideas, some of these same concepts, some of the same mythological background, but I make the guy white and I put him on a horse and I have a princess in the story, and let's go from there. And so I did that.
Retroped
it. I just retroped it, and it sold very quickly. And after that, I was really able to sell things on outline for quite a while.
So when you, well, first off, let's see. When you kind of retooled the ideas that you had, put it in Waterborne, what was it about that book that made it special to you? Other than the marketing aspects that the publisher talked about, was there anything to you that stuck out about this book that made it special?
Well, I really enjoyed writing it. I mean, I say I repurposed it, but I actually did some more research. I read a lot of sort of North Asian, Central Asian mythology, and the character of the crow or the raven is very essential. And I found a lot of really interesting things about that character mythologically, to the point that I actually wrote an academic paper about the various words that people use across the word to describe, to name ravens and crows, and why that they're all so consistently similar. But I had written several books before, all of which were interesting to me. I usually don't start writing things that I'm not interested in. So I guess in the end, what made that book so special to me was that it was the one that got published. but I still have a pretty soft spot for it. I re-edited it, and I didn't do much to it because I don't really want to rewrite my past. But they made an ebook out of it a while back, and I went back through and read it, and I was both surprised at how good parts of it were, and how at times I would be like, I would never do that now.
Right.
But there's certain virtues to being young, and there are certain deficits. So, but I was a little bit surprised at how different it was from what I write now in some ways.
Those early novels that you wrote, have you done anything with those?
Well, one of them was Footsteps in the Sky, which is the science fiction novel, and that was a book about basically descendants of people who consider themselves to be Pueblo Indians, like the Hopi and the Acoma. Zuni are being used to colonize and terraform a distant planet. And so that was a book that I actually sold after I sold The Water. I read it before The Waterborn, but after The Waterborn, I sold it as part of the package deal with my next set of novels. But they never published it for fear that my science fiction sales would poison my fantasy sales.
What a crock!
Because there was some.
Yeah, I said what a crock, but yeah, I
right. Well, I mean, at the time, you could get into a downward spiral if Barnes and Nobles bought a certain number of your books and then didn't sell them all. Then they would buy fewer the next time. So science fiction in general sells less than fantasy. So they were afraid that if I published a science fiction novel, so anyway, they paid me for it. I got the money and everything, but they never made a book out of it. And a few years ago, I pulled it out and dusted it off, and I really felt like, it deserved some kind of life. And so I had it published as an ebook and as a kind of a small print paperback. And again, it's kind of interesting because it's not a book I would write now, and a lot of the things I do in it are things I absolutely would not do as a writer now. But I felt really I had to kind of leave it the way it was. I didn't really alter it very much.
It sounds like you do a lot of research for your books, and that a lot of these themes from maybe different cultures and maybe ancient cultures kind of influence and inform some of the world building that you do. And I think we all have read books where maybe fantasy where they're just making things up out of whole cloth, and for some reason they just don't work as well as when you can maybe subconsciously sense that this is something that is been before, or I don't really know how to explain that, but do you know what I mean? That sometimes when things are grounded in something that's already been, they tend to have a richness to it.
I agree. I think there's a reason that we're still telling some of the same stories, that we were telling 1,000 years ago. I think there's a reason why the Beowulf's still relevant to a certain extent, and why the Odyssey and the Iliad are still relevant. They're part of a fabric, or for that matter, any number of epics from anywhere in the world. They're all kind of a fabric of our human experience. One of the things that really attracted me to Tolkien initially, and again, I had the Return of the King first, are the appendices in that book, which kind of laid out. This is before the Silmarillion was published and all that, so it just kind of laid out. The languages and the writing systems and some of the early history, and I realized, this guy's got it all worked out. And not only does he have it all worked out, but it was actually that led me to read Norse mythology and Celtic mythology, because it all articulated, because that's where he was getting it from. So Tolkien, even though he created this massive and amazing universe, he didn't do it from nothing. And what I got interested in was the something he had pulled that out of. And pretty much everything I've written, very often, before I start and while I'm working on it, I do two kinds of research. Sometimes it's research into things like what kind of shoes were they wearing at the French court in the 18th century, if I'm writing a book written in the 18th century, or details about a town in Malaysia if I'm setting something in Malaysia. But also I read a lot of mythology and folklore and fairy tales and that sort of thing, just to sort of ground myself in all of that before I write my own stuff.
How do you, as a writer, take those tales that are familiar in some way, even though we may not be as familiar now as we once were? But how do you take those tales that are familiar on some level and make them and make stories informed by them that are fresh and new?
I'm not sure, because for me, it's not a completely conscious thing. What I do is I do a lot of reading, and I let it just kind of muddle around in my head, and then I start writing. And a good example of that would be, right now I'm working on some books that I've sold them. The first one will be published about a year from now. And they started life as I was trying to write young adult novels, and they went a little bit weird from there. But they're kind of interesting because they're the first books that I've written that have a really direct connection to where I'm from. The town that they start in is the fictional town of Salwashi, which was what Meridian was going to originally be called, and it draws on some of the folklore just of the town and of the Choctaw and the white settlers, and then it articulates at one point with the bigger picture. I mean, I'm reading Slavic mythology and Lithuanian mythology and Egyptian mythology and folklore, because it all hangs together at some point.
Yeah.
And but I don't necessarily have a plan as to how to do it. I don't usually take, for instance, a particular fairy tale and decide to retell it. I just read a bunch of stuff, and it kind of works its way through my head, and I start writing, and I sort of see where it goes, which isn't a very precise way of explaining. But
no, I totally get it. Most of the things I write are in a fictional town in the Mississippi Delta. I made up a town called Weston, and I like to describe it as the place where the veil between this world and the next one is a little thinner in Weston. Maybe it's the crossroads. Maybe it's some ancient Native American burial grounds that are close by. But and again, I like to bring in those elements of some ancient mythologies from around the world, because I do think they're connected and they do have relevance to our mythologies and things like that. So I can't wait to read that. That's going to be awesome.
Sure, and there's some kind of fun things to play with in Meridian. For instance, you've got the Gypsy Queen's grave there.
Yeah,
and there's a whole interesting history there, and then just all the sort of Masonic, Neo-Egyptian, Art Nouveau symbolism in the downtown area, which is now kind of falling apart, but it's it's some beautiful stuff down there and very interesting. But go ahead.
My maternal grandfather was a Shriner and really high-ranking Mason here, and I inherited all of his Masonic stuff.
Oh, that's cool.
When he died, and I have never been a Mason or been involved with it, but I find that stuff fascinating, and that stuff winds its way into some of the stories I tell as well. So yeah, there's and those are parts of our collective mythology that people overlook sometimes, is the mythology that's kind of oozed its way into the present, that are fun to play with.
Oh, sure, and that's stuff that's been working its way in for centuries,
Right.
via the European Enlightenment, through Greece. Before that, it's really interesting stuff. Most of this stuff doesn't ever seem to go away. It just kind of gradually shifts into something else. So
right. You wrote a series that I find greatly fascinating, and that is The Age of Unreason, which begins with Newton's canon. What got you into writing history, if not alternate history, but kind of fantastic history? What got you into that?
Well, what happened? What was going on? A couple things were happening at that point. I was doing my field work. For my, I guess ultimately, I was doing field work that eventually I was going to use for a PhD. I never finished. But I was doing field with the Choctaw in the area around Conehatta, which is if you know where that is.
Yeah, close to Philadelphia.
No, Conehatta's not. It's over closer to Decatur.
Yeah.
Anyway,
yeah.
It's a different Choctaw community. But I was working there, but I was staying with a friend over near Corinth, and I was driving back and forth between the reservation and Corinth on these clearly 19th century roads that had only recently been paved, and a lot of them didn't really. They used to go to places that were important, but they're not anymore, right? So I kept thinking about that landscape. And I was thinking about an alternate South, actually, initially, in which, like Native American, in particular, might have had a more fundamental influence on the way that things turned out. But the only way I could think of for that to happen is if something really terrible happened to England. And so I had that idea in my head, and then I told my first novel, Waterborne, and my wife had never been overseas, so we went to Italy, to Florence, where I saw all this, Renaissance stuff, this museum of scientific instruments with all this really fascinating things. And then we went to Prague, which has this long kind of, science and arcane history of the golem and John Dee, and all these characters that were hanging out in Prague, and that all kind of mishmashed in with that original idea. And then I got back, and my editor asked me if I had any strange, dark, proggy ideas for a novel while I was gone. And I said, well, yeah. And I just kind of outlined something I'd been thinking about. But it was set in the American South about now, in this alternate history where things had gone terribly, terribly wrong for the British. And I thought we were just talking. I had no idea I was pitching a novel. And she called me back about 2 days later, and she said, that's great. Everybody likes it. Can you write that as a trilogy, and can you set it at the hinge point? That is, can you, instead of setting it in the present time, can you go back and start from where things went wrong? And I actually had no idea if I could do that or not. But, I had just sold my first novel, and I was like, right on the edge of maybe having a career in this. And so I said, yeah, of course I can do that. And I just ran to the library, and I got several versions of those timelines of history where they have history laid out in this sort of linear fashion. So you can go through the years and you can see on any given year what was happening in Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas in terms of science, literature. Have you ever seen one of these? Yeah, and so I kind of went through that, and I tried to figure out who would be alive at about the time that things were going terribly wrong for the British. And I thought, okay, Ben Franklin, he's only 15, but he's alive. And Louis XIV. And it just happened to be a time where there were a lot of really fascinating people alive anyway. Peter the Great and Isaac Newton and a lot of more Voltaire, and a lot of slightly more obscure but still really fascinating characters. So pretty quickly I put something together, and I had been studying the 18th century in terms of the impact of colonialism on the Southeast. Anyway, so I knew what was going on in North America, like say in 1710. I just didn't know that much about what was going on in Europe in 1710, but I did come up to speed. Part of that I think was my academic background. I kind of knew how to do this, where to find the sources and all that. This is before there's anything on the internet. But I had a research library. I was at UGA, University of Georgia, and they have a great research library. So I probably did more research for those books than for anything else I've ever written. But I think the main impetus was when I was reading something of Newton's. Oh, there are my dogs. I was reading something of Newton's, and he was talking about he had written in his notebooks that he had discovered it. Eureka! I found it. And I found a whole doctoral dissertation about what he thought he had found. And
wow.
A couple of weeks after he wrote that, apparently he went back and kind of crossed through it and said, never mind. But I thought, well, what if it wasn't never mind? What if what he just thought he discovered at that point was what he discovered? And what if he was better remembered for that than for the things that we remember him for, like gravity and calculus and so forth? So, and he even made some comment in one of he did a series of questions, and he made a comment, and I'm going to have to paraphrase here, but he said essentially that, the nature of our universe is determined by the sizes and the qualities of the particles that God created. And if God wanted to create a different kind of universe, he would just create, particles with different sizes and qualities. And he could create, if he wanted, an infinite number of universes just by doing that. And so I thought that was a really good departure point, was the speculation of his.
Well, and that's great fodder for speculative fiction writers. That's just pregnant with all sorts of ideas. So that I just one-clicked that whole 4-book series because I'm going to start reading that today. It looks amazing. So that you followed your initial book up with that series. Did you write that whole series back to back?
Pretty much, yeah. I actually, toward the end of it, I believe I started at some point during that period. We moved from Athens, Georgia, to Seattle, Washington. My wife was working on her MFA in metalworking, and again, though, I had access to a wonderful research library in the University of Washington, and also at that point in time, they started tapping me. Del Rey, who was my publisher at the time, started tapping me to do not novelizations, but tie-in work, which I had not done before. And so I believe during the writing of the last 2 of those books, I was also in the process of writing Babylon 5 and a couple of Star Wars novels. So I didn't write them.
That was going to be the next place I steered you, was how did you get into doing these novelizations? Because you've done Star Wars, Babylon 5, let's see, what else? Elder Scrolls, you've got some Planet of the Apes. You did the novelization for Interstellar. Yeah. Just some awesome, amazing work that you've done.
Well, first of all, thank you. But at first I was a little bit hesitant to do licensed work because I kind of came in from an environment in which that was a little bit looked down on, unjustly so in a lot of cases, because some of the first things I read that I really loved would be, for instance, James Blish's novelizations of the Star Trek, the original series plots, and James Alan Dean Foster's work on the anime series, and also on a number of other things that he did, including, I think, the first Star Wars novel.
Yeah, he was on the show just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. He's a great guy.
He is.
He's a character.
But anyway,
sure. so I since I started publishing my own stuff, I was a little hesitant to get distracted maybe by doing that. But what happened was I was a huge fan of the Babylon 5 television show. I thought it was the best science fiction on TV at the time. And I essentially was at a Nebula Awards ceremony, and one of the editors, not my editor, but one of the editors from Random House was sitting next to me, Steve Saffel. And they won. And I said, wow, they really deserve that. That's great. I feel good for them. And he says, oh, you like that series? And I said, yeah, I love Babylon 5. He says, okay. And then like a week later, he said, well, do you want to write some books for them? And at the time I was in Seattle, I said, sure. And that was fun because for a lot of reasons. But one was that they actually flew me down to meet Straczynski and watch them film an episode and kind of convince him that I was the guy to do it. And then I also had just really, really good access to them while I was writing. I could just, if I had a question, I could just call, and talk to his assistant, Fiona Avery. So that was my first experience with licensed stuff, was that. And then I was offered Star Wars. And I guess Terry Brooks, who also lived in Seattle, had just done Star Wars. And, I kind of asked him what he thought about it. He said, yeah. He said, do it. And I, of course, loved Star Wars. When I first saw that in Meridian, I was, I think, in 9th grade. And it was sort of the movie I had been waiting my whole life to see. When that first ship came over, I just started grinning, and I didn't stop, I don't think, until the end of the movie. So it was a little, at that point, it was a little bit intimidating just because so many books had been written that I frankly hadn't read. And I was afraid of wrong, but I had friends like Mike Stackpole, and I could say, look, what do I have to read? How do I come up to speed on this fast? And he and some other people laid it out for me. So I agreed to do that. And that was fun. And then just since then, Steve Saffel's been the editor on quite a few of the licensed things I've done, including the novelization of Interstellar and the more recent, the recent Planet of the Apes novels.
Several questions come to mind, but first off, how do you? How much license do you have when telling these stories? And the novelizations obviously go into more detail and sometimes some backstory and things like that aren't conveyed on the screen. As the writer who's taken this on, how much guidance are you given?
That has been completely variable. When I was working with Babylon 5,
of course.
I was working with Babylon 5. I actually was working from outlines written by Straczynski. But within these outlines were like a paragraph long. And within those outlines, I was given a great deal of latitude. And anytime I had a question about it, I just called, right? How many countries, which countries are in the Earth Alliance? Well, these we know, and then just make up the rest. That was, Star Wars was a little, there are more rules in place. There's sort of a Bible in place. But at the same time, we were doing something a little bit different. And there were a lot of conference calls where I was talking to other writers, to editors, to people from Lucasfilms. So there was a lot of sort of socialization, I guess, in the writing of those books. And there are definitely things you can and can't do in a Star Wars novel. And there at the time anyway was a room. I'm calling it a room. It's really a virtual room. A group of people who, for no pay at all, would read the drafts of these books, and they were just basically huge Star Wars fans, and they would say, essentially, this is or this isn't a Star Wars book. This guy did or did not get Han Solo right, or Mara Jade, or whoever. And there were books that sank because the authors could never convince those readers that.
Yeah, how intimidating!
That's intimidating,
is that?
But
yeah.
I had relatively little trouble with it. I enjoyed it, it was pretty fun. I kind of liken it to writing a haiku, right? Writing a haiku is confining, it's constraining, but in its own way, though, it forces you to think about how to say something concisely, right? Or I guess I would say that about tweets, except I don't tweet, so I don't know. But but when you're forced to work within a form or within a genre or within especially a licensed work. Now, in other things, Interstellar is the only actual novelization I've done. Everything else I've done has been a related work, like a tie-in or in the case of the Planet of the Apes books, I wrote books that are set between the movies, kind of explaining what happened in the intervening years. Interstellar was something they really did not want messed with much. So my original first draft was a lot longer than what got published because they essentially said we don't want a lot of backstory about these characters. If it's not in the movie, they pretty much didn't want it in the book. So I was allowed to do some internal dialogue as long as it seemed to follow naturally from the situation or from things that the character had said. But it was definitely a bit more constrained than pretty much anything I've ever done, even if, to start with, by the fact that all the dialogue is already decided for me. Still was interesting, and I to do that had to go to L.A. and sit in Christopher Nolan's office. He wasn't there. I never met him, but I sat in his office with the script for 4 days because they wouldn't let me have a copy of the script.
Wow.
Because they're just very careful about these things. And then I actually got flown back out there to see a premiere of the movie because I had not seen the movie, and there was still time for me to add some visual things that I wasn't aware of.
Wow, how cool is that? So you have been writing professionally for quite a while now. I mean, this is what you do. How do you approach business or writing as your business, and while maintaining? I think a lot of people feel like that that once you become a professional at something, that some of the love and some of the passion goes away. Do you ever struggle with that?
Well, I guess a little bit, but ultimately not that much, and I'll tell you why. It's because I probably worked harder at this when I was trying to break in some ways. Right. I certainly, and I did it without knowing if anything was going anywhere. In terms of, I guess I've always treated it very much like any other business. When I first started writing, I wrote literally, like 9 to 5. Because I mostly wrote in the summer or at night. And when I was really getting making progress, what I would do is I would just sit down and I would write starting at 8 or 9 o'clock. I would write till noon. I would take a break and eat lunch. I would start again. I would finish at 5, and then I would go to the bar or whatever. I treated it very much like a job. I do it a little less so now because I now have kids. I have some other responsibilities. But on the other hand, I tend to know what I'm going to be working on in advance.
Yeah.
So I don't know what to say about it. It's like any job. It's even a job you love. There are down moments and there are times where you think, you might be better off doing something else. But for the most part, I don't feel that way. Because, the greatest downside, I would say, is that you're alone a lot. And I'm fairly, no pun intended, a fairly gregarious person. But I can make up for that, after hours. So I'm still usually done by 5. I'm usually done these days by the time I pick up my kids from school.
How do you treat your writing process? I know a lot of research goes into your books, and a lot of the if only to kind of get a feel for settings and things like that to just kind of have in your mind. But when you begin a project, do you outline it all the way out? Do you leave some room to discover as you go, or kind of what's your process like?
I do all of that. So I tend to outline, and early on especially, and anytime I do license work, I outline in great detail. But in books like The Age of Unreason, that series, or the Briar King books, or basically any of my original works, my outline is usually left far behind pretty early in the process. And the same is true of The Waterborne. I had an outline that would have gotten my main character killed about halfway through the book, the first book. And it was just because I hadn't realized I hadn't been writing that character as a character, and I didn't understand that when I got into this particular juncture that this guy, as I had been writing him, would never do the smart thing and survive. And so I had just had to stop and think, well, I either start over so that I can follow my outline, or I figure out how things go from here to make things work. And that's very much my process when I'm writing my own things. I write an outline. I want to know where it's going. Want to know where things end up. I want to know what kind of the big picture is that's going on behind it all. But very often I find out that I'm much better at writing than I am at outlining. I'm not, particularly good at or inspired at outlining, but it's in the process of writing and the process of sort of discovering these characters that I'm imagining that really cool things happen, the best things. Now, all that said, when I'm doing something that's licensed, I don't really have that option. I can't go very far outside of the lines of what I said I would do, because there's this lengthy approval process for outlines in that business. So if I tell Lucasfilms, or now Disney, what I'm going to do with the Star Wars book in an outline, I pretty much better do that. Like unless I get special permission to do something really different. And the same is true of, I did the the Planet of the Apes book certainly, and I also recently did a book set between the two Independence Day movies. And once you've got your outline approved, you really don't want to have to go back and get everybody involved to approve it again, because there are usually quite a number of people involved, producers and script writers and editors and so forth.
Speaking of the Planet of the Apes, your newest book, War for the Planet of the Apes Revelations, comes out on June 6th. We're going to put a link to that in the show notes. Do you, when you're doing these books that are kind of between episodes, how much are you given much guidance from the franchise owners about kind of the points that they want to hit here, or are you given more license with those?
That's also pretty variable, and it varies for me even within the Planet of the Apes franchise. So the first one I did was set between the first of the kind of reboots and the second. So there's I think almost a 20-year gap between those two movies, when the virus that makes the chimps smart but kills people is invented, and or not just chimps but all of the great apes is invented, and when humans and apes come into conflict again. And I kind of was allowed to play anywhere in that period, as long as I didn't give away too much about what we were going to see in the second movie. They had a whole bunch of stuff that they wanted to hold close to their chest there, with good reason, because it was kind of spectacular. And so in that case, I chose to set my story pretty close to the end of the first movie, because that way I wouldn't have to move too far into their future and suggest some things they were trying not to deal with. And in the more recent one, there were even a few more constraints. They said you can deal with this, or this, but leave all these other things alone. And then the other thing I've done like that more recently was the Independence Day book, where again you've got a 20-year gap between the two movies, and in that case there was so much to cover. Everything that happened to all the old characters, introducing the new characters, and just 20 years worth of history. There, the problem was actually honing things down to what I was going to deal with, and leaving off what I wasn't.
That has to be murder, walking around with this knowledge that you can't share with anybody, and going to dinner parties and stuff. And so, Greg, what are you working on these days? I can't tell.
There's a lot of that. Yeah, there's a lot of I can't talk about this at all. I don't know. It's just, it lends an air of mystery, I guess, and then eventually everybody does find out what's going on. But yeah, I mean, it's not just a code of honor either. There are all sorts of non-disclosure documents you sign.
Right.
Also, if you want to just continue working in this kind of stuff, nobody's going to choose you if they know you're a blabbermouth. So,
right. There's definitely a code of honor that has to be adhered to for sure. And like you said, legal reasons. But your character as being someone that can be tapped and relied upon, you definitely don't want to squander that. Yeah. So after this book, you mentioned earlier that you're launching this new series, kind of based in Sawashi, Mississippi. When can we expect to see that?
The series is called right now. This is tentative, but it's called The High and the Far Away, and the first novel is called The Reign and the Departed. Reign as in REIGN. And The Reign of the Departed essentially is our world. But I think spring of 2018 is when the first of those comes out, and then should be a year. It's going to be a trilogy, and I'm working on the second book in the trilogy right now. And those will come out about a year apart, I think.
Awesome. Who's publishing those?
Nightshade.
Okay, cool. Greg, it has been great fun talking to you. I'm so glad that we finally got to connect. Where can people find your work if they have been fascinated by what you've talked about and want to get plugged in? I'm going to put a link to your Amazon page. Do you have any other place you'd like to send people?
Not really. I mean, most bookstores carry at least some of my books, and then there's Amazon, and then Open Road Media has a lot of my books in ebook form that aren't available otherwise or are difficult to find otherwise. A lot of my earlier stuff.
Great. I'll send people to pick it up. Thank you so much, Greg, for taking time to come
All
on
right,
the show.
thank you.
Now stay tuned for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Gleaves. Pick up the entire Jason Crane series. Link in the show notes.
The year was 1834. The month was December. I was 14. Irving's tale was by then well known. The characters of Brom Bones and the beauteous Katrina were widely understood in town to refer to my parents. Rumors persisted. I heard the name of Headless Horseman whispered. My father dismissed all these tales, calling them malicious. Yet more than once I saw him and my mother scanning Agatha's face across the supper table, finding only a secret smile and a look of defiance. I found the rumors fascinating. I followed Agatha like a pup, waiting for her to cast some magic spell. And one day she did. The household servants had set a fire in the hearth for her comfort, and she sat close to it, counting out small gold coins upon a lapboard. I hid in the shadows, hoping she might drop a coin and I could retrieve it for myself. One of her servants, a West Indian girl, carried a snowy log into the room and set it on the fire. It began to hiss and pop, the snow melted, and the fire sputtered out. Agatha cursed as I had never heard her do before. She stood, spilling all the gold, and slapped the idiot girl across the face. The girl ran, and my grandmother muttered to herself, searching for match and tong to no avail. When she was not looking, I crept forward and took for myself one of the gold pieces. Then something remarkable occurred. My grandmother sighed, knelt before the fireplace, reached for the logs, and her right hand caught a fire. Flame blossomed and coiled about her wrist. I gasped and cried out, "Shh! Don't be afraid, my Dylan." "Your hand!" She raised her palm. Flame sat cupped in it, casting the shadow of her fingers upon the ceiling and walls. "Lock the door," she said. I obeyed. She pointed to the floor, and I sat, waiting breathlessly. "This is the Van Brunt gift. It will be your gift as well, soon, and your children's forever afterwards." "Why does it not burn you?" I asked. "Why should it? Do I deserve to be burned?" "No." "Then I am safe from the fire. Do you deserve to be burned, my Dylan?" I shook my head. "Show me." I reached for the flame and took it. I pulled back at once, crying out with pain, wagging my fingertips. The fire caught my sleeve. I could not rid myself of it, as if I clutched burning tar. The pain intensified. The blisters broke, and a rivulet of lymph ran down my arm. "Your conscience knows, Dylan. You deserved to be burned. Say it." "I deserved to be burned," said I. "Again." "I deserved to be burned." She turned her palm. "The gold piece." I nodded and brought the stolen coin from my pocket. She took it and raised it to the light. "You cannot wield the flame with guilt in your heart, son. Try, and it will devour you. Do you understand?" I nodded. "A Van Brunt should not be so weak." "I'm sorry I took the gold, Grandmother. I'm sorry I was bad. Don't be ashamed of me." She frowned and laid the gold coin on her lapboard. She shook her head sadly. "I'm not ashamed that you took the gold. I'm ashamed that you felt the guilt."
You've been listening to the Author Stories podcast with Hank Garner. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. When you're there, please subscribe to the show and leave a comment over on iTunes.